Hi friends, welcome to Key to Pictures. What is the exposure triangle? Basically, the exposure triangle are three ways that light affects your camera and enters your camera to create the perfect exposure. So, for example, in the exposure triangle, we have ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. So those three things work in tandem to create the perfect amount of light hitting your sensor in your camera. So ISO it basically measures how sensitive your camera is to the light that is entering into it. Remember with a film camera, we would buy film cartridges in certain speeds. So most people would buy 400 ISO, and that just is kind of a even well-rounded number. I always keep my digital camera on a 400 ISO to begin with. But as you get if you make your camera a lower ISO of say 100, that just means that your camera is going to be less sensitive to the light that's entering into it. If you increase your ISO to say 1600, your camera is going to be more sensitive to the light that's entering into it. Which means that if you don't have a lot of light in your room or outside when you're taking pictures, then you can increase that ISO and it will basically create more light for you. It will make your camera more sensitive to the light that you're actually able to get in onto your sensor. The next piece of the exposure triangle is aperture. And aperture is basically the size of the opening in your lens. So in your lens, you have 5 or 6 blades that basically overlap each other and can create this circle. And they can open up wide to create a very wide aperture, or they can be very, very small to create a very small aperture. So you see this and you change it on your camera. You change the aperture on your camera with the numbers like 1.8 would be a very wide and open aperture, all the way up to f16. So it'd be, aperture is also called f-stop. So you'd see an F and a backslash and then the number. So an f/16 would, in your actual lens, it would look like a very, very small opening in your lens, thus allowing only a little bit of light to come through and enter your camera and hit the sensor. If you have a very wide opening, say an aperture of 1.8, so it would look like f/1.8, it would mean that your lens is opened up very wide, and there's a lot of light that can flood into your camera and land on that sensor. So the last piece of the triangle puzzle is the shutter speed. And shutter speed, inside your camera, there is the camera sensor, and then over it is the shutter that can actually open and close. So if you had a very long shutter speed of say 3 seconds, that means the shutter on your camera is opening up for 3 whole seconds while light is flooding in. If you had a very fast shutter speed of say 1/25 of a second, so it would look like on your camera, it would say 125, then that means that your shutter is opening up for just a split second, for 1/25 of a second, thus allowing just a little bit of light to enter your camera and affect that sensor. So basically, these 3 things are working in tandem to create that perfect exposure, that perfect amount of light hitting your sensor. And when you change or manipulate one, it's going to affect the other ones. So you could see that if you had a very wide open aperture of say 1.8, then you're getting a lot of light through your aperture, thus meaning that you only need your shutter to be open for just a short amount of time. And also it would affect your ISO, your ISO wouldn't need to be as sensitive because you're getting so much light from that aperture. So you could have a lower shutter speed. So I talked about this in another video and how those really affect each other and how you change them and work with it on your camera. But for now, just understand that there are 3 ways that light enters your camera and affects the exposure, and that's through ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. And I want to, of course, leave you with a quote, and the quote is, it's by Robert H. Schuller, and he said, "The only place where your dream becomes impossible is in your own thinking." And isn't that so true? We tend to be our own worst critics, and we're probably the ones that tell ourselves the most that things can't happen. But if we can get past ourselves and convince ourselves that our dreams really are possible, then they will come true. And I know that's happened so many times in my life. I'll write down a goal, or I'll have a dream, and my mind tells me that's impossible. But as I can work past that and get through it, then my dream does become reality. So make it a great day, and I will see you soon.